I'm interviewing Professor Linden West, and in particular about his most recent publication, Distress in the City, which comes with a subtitle, Racism, Fundamentalism, and a Democratic Education. And I want to start with just opening up three broad themes, but there's a sense that within this book there are a number of stories. There's a story about education and democracy, which I think the title lets us into. There's a story about yourself, about Linden West, as a young academic and a young man in Stoke, and how that young man has changed and how Stoke has changed. And then I think there's some very interesting stories of three, I suppose what we would say would be seminal or influential authors. We have Temple, Tawney, and Williams. Maybe start off by telling us something about what you think education might be, or what you think democracy might be, and the link between them.
I think we've got a challenge in thinking about the basic question of how people, as we might put it, learn democracy. And it seems to me it's an important responsibility of educational institutions, not least universities. And I think we neglect the subject at our peril. I'd want to put alongside the notion of learning democracy multiculturalism, because it seems to me that whether we take this country or other countries like France, we are struggling with these issues about how different communities with different traditions and backgrounds relate one to another. At one level, Alan, the issue is quite simple about democracy and education. You can take a kind of what I would call a banking model of education. So you can try to stuff people's heads with facts about the British Constitution, whatever that is, or how Parliament works, about maybe obligations to vote, etc., etc. I'm not sure that's too successful, nor am I sure that the kind of personal and health and social education within schools is at all successful as well. Now, noble attempts have been made by many colleagues at the university, Canterbury Christchurch University, to develop the whole area of civic education. Whether it's to do with the fact that teachers in schools and other institutions are very hard pressed, and it's not where the priority lies, the priority is elsewhere. Frankly, it seems to degenerate into not a great deal. So that civic responsibility gets translated into, at worst, and I'm quoting from a colleague here, into litter collection. Set that alongside, a group of young mums in a difficult community in Thanet in East Kent, and many of whom were deeply alienated from education. They have been regarded as problem families by authorities, some of which they've internalized, so they don't think very highly of themselves. And then I see a project where the focus had originally been the quality of the interactions between groups of professionals and individual families. But what began to interest me far more than that was the creation of what I call an agora, a sort of public space in which some of these young women were actually, or had learned the way of talking back to power in an assertive way. Not in an angry way necessarily, but in an assertive way, challenging professionals, challenging the management of the program. And what I saw in front of my eyes was what the philosopher Gert Biester calls not the socialization concept, but subjectification, by which people are learning democracy in effect experientially, in a culture that seemed to me to be characterized by a number of things. One was a sense of equality. This is a long struggle to achieve. It's not an easy thing at all.
Yeah.
Some degree of trust and openness, and alongside that, a respectfulness towards what people were saying one to another, and what we might call a more dialogical form of human communication. So this seemed to me to be the very tissues, the very lifeblood what we might call building in what seemed to be a very unpropitious set of circumstances, something like an agora, something like an educated democracy. And the challenge that I've got, I think, and it's there at the heart of the book, what are we in a range of other institutions, including universities, doing to make our democracy in a kind of lived, participative sense in civil society, across civil society, work far better than it is? Okay. It seems to me the challenge in a place like Stoke is you've got, and elsewhere, is you've got solipsistic communities that are increasingly in retreat one from another, and the extent to which those kind of that dialogue across difference is taking place is minimal.
Okay, so there's a sense in your answer there that there's a tension between the idea of education as a banking model, and we can teach people to be democratic. We can teach people how to be good civil citizens. And part of that tension is possibly in the way in which we do the education. And the argument being that maybe there's a more democratic way of doing education. And you mentioned the notion of the agora, of a public space to hear difficult conversations, I suppose, to hear different points of view. One of the central themes in the book is to talk about the idea of the tutorial group.
Yes.
And the tutorial group as being a space where this can happen. Now, I'm thinking of using a quote that's in the book, where something is written that says, past is the place where things have been done differently.
Yes.
So take us back to that time when there were what were perceived to be tutorial groups.
Yes.
And maybe if you can, just talk about how we could learn from that experience in the present, in the context of democracy.
Yes. You have to remember that I started my academic life as a historian. And when I began to work in depth in Stoke, I was troubled. I was troubled by expressions of racism.
This is this time you went back to Stoke in about
2008, 2009, roughly at the same time as I'd been working in Thanet.
Sure.
And that deeply disturbed me. There were attacks on a mosque and other incidents of violence. So that I guess I thought, well, where historically were the spaces that people might have learnt across difference? Where were the spaces where people could debate things robustly, and yet at the same time respectfully one with another, in a spirit of what we might call equality, of openness and trust? It's the same values. The words are almost taken directly from Anthony Giddens' The Democracy of the Emotions, which seems to me an important part of this.
Sure.
So I thought, well, maybe I need to go back and look at some of the early historical writings I did on the tutorial classes. Now, basically what these were about was that towards the end of the 19th century, universities like Oxford, and there were very few universities around at that time, had organised programmes of extension lectures in some of the industrial areas of the Midlands and the north of England. Places like Rochdale were involved, where the pioneers, the cooperators, had an active programme of extension lectures, and in Stoke there was a similar sort of programme, and some of the students, I think, involved in those. So the idea in the extension lectures that people would basically give lectures, and some of them were, very entertaining. And I think some of the working class people attending some of those lectures, who were also trade unionists, they were active in bodies like the Social Democratic Federation, which was a Marxist organisation in Stoke. Some of the, other politicos wanted something more substantial, basically. So after a long period of time, the tutorial classes were established. So rather than lectures of 100 people, about 30 men and women, quite diverse women, and this is an important point, met every week in Longton, which became part of the city of Stoke-on-Trent 2 or 3 years later. So we're 1908 now. 30 or so men and women, some elementary school teachers, potters, miners, a whole host of people. and there was a similar equivalent thing going on in Rochdale. There were a number of kind of values implicit in the way the things were established, so there wouldn't be competitive exams.
Okay.
And the reason for that was that it was felt that this would distort the learning. That the learning had to be constructed around a negotiation of what the students themselves wanted to learn and what the university thought itself, in this case it was the University of Oxford, thought might be appropriate. And that the spirit of these tutorial classes would be one in which people would go where the spirit of learning took them,
Okay.
not where an examination
So
syllabus.
very different to current times of learning outcomes and learning objectives.
Very, very different.
Right.
Very different. And in my re-examination of my own work and going back to some of the literature, much more recent research, there's a seminal text by Jonathan Rose, The Intellectual History of the British Working Classes, I think, which I then came across. I looked at that and there'd been a great contention in workers' education, as it came to be called, in the UK. So one argument was that these tutorial classes had kind of sparked the potential radicalism of the autodidacts.
Yeah.
People who were self-taught, who wanted serious knowledge, serious learning, and turn their Marxism into kind of respectable university studies and so on. Rose, in doing his work, challenged that view, as did a number of other historians like Lawrence Goldman, whose work on Oxford and working class education I think is also an important text. And I really looked at what I'd written in 1972 and I thought, hang on a minute, I'm not sure I got this right. So I revisited some of my own materials.
Yes.
I've always been interested in history, and I'd been thinking at some stage I'd like to write more about the period, including writing some novels.
Yeah.
Because there are one or two characters from Stoke who went to Oxford eventually. They attended summer schools, and one or two of them got degrees from Oxford. And I thought it would be interesting to enter an imaginative space.
Yeah.
There's someone called Fred Emery. There's someone called Frank Pickstock who intrigues me. Ordinary guys. Pickstock was a railwayman. He went to Oxford. Emery went back to Stoke to become a tutorial class teacher. Right. Working for the Oxford University Extramural Department and the WA. It was actually called Oxford Extension, I think. But in the doing of the educational thing, I know that his marriage bust up, and there was obviously a lot of negotiation going on at some level as to who he was. Anyway, I went back to look at my work, and frankly, I thought actually there's something needs to be revised. The other reason that was in my mind at the time was, I'm a child of the 60s, Alan. You have to put this in context. Many of us were determined to create the future in our own image. And we thought, on the whole, utterly arrogantly, that our parents had contributed very little. Look, they'd established a very paternalistic welfare state. Look at these courses at university. They were very paternalistic. We were being told from on high what to think and feel. From the perspective of 1968, 69, 70, that's all very understandable. From the perspective of 2016, it looks filled to completion with hubris. When I was a child, we had free milk.
Yeah.
And this was provided by the state. And I've always thought of this as very symbolic of the state nurturing the child. We had free education. Many of us, it enabled working class people in many families for the first time to go to university. We had the prospect of full employment.
Full employment as well.
We had a welfare state. So if someone was ill in my own family, there had been that terrible anxiety of how to pay the doctor's bill. All that, by and large, went. And I don't think we quite realised. Francis Beckett, who has written about the 60s and what the baby boomers did for us, made the remark that we thought, i.e. the 60s generation, that we were going to build a New Jerusalem. What we probably didn't realise at the time was a lot of the New Jerusalem was around at the time, but we never recognised it properly.
Yeah. There's also something in there about workers' education.
Mm.
The quote, the best police expenditure,
Yeah.
because it was almost considered as a form of social control. Let's get the working classes involved in adult education,
Yeah.
and we'll tell them what the answers are.
Yes. Well, this was the great criticism. There were some historians who made the case very forcefully. I think by the noughties of this century, I was much more attuned to basing judgment on what we might call narrative evidence, life stories, life documents of a wide range of kinds. And that was how I was inspired by Jonathan Rose's work, because that's precisely what he did. So let's go back and listen to what some of the, I call them autodidacts, it's a shorthand, but I think you've got a sense of what I mean. And what I was beginning to realize was that if we think that one of the great purposes of education is to create a spirit of informed, thoughtful agency, there were lots of examples of just how important the tutorial class movement had been in creating agency at many different levels. The number of people who went through the tutorial classes and played a prominent role in trade unions, in political parties, in the struggle actually for the welfare state, but at another more, if you like, intimate kind of micro level, people who got involved in school governors or would talk about challenging the teacher when he or she made what was seen to be negative judgments about a child, in ways that the way the stories were told was quite a huge step in terms of someone's identity. So all that evidence began to make me think, hang on, look, maybe we should spend a bit of time not only looking historically at the tutorial classes, but trying to get hold of some of the tissues of the way this actually worked between people. Spending time with the stories people told, with the documentation, and that's what I did. And I think what I began to realise, and R.H. Tawney, you've mentioned Raymond Williams, William Temple, Archbishop of Canterbury, and also someone called Sandy Lindsay, A.D. Sandy Lindsay, who was a philosopher, who actually became the first principal of what was the University College of North Staffordshire, later the University of Kiel, thought was that what we had was actually the microcosms of the good, educated democracy in these tutorial classes. They would have used the word socialism. It's only recently we've been allowed to use that again, but they would have called it an educated socialist democracy, or one or two of them would.
What could be happening now with the expansion of higher education? If we're not careful, what we set up within adult education or even higher education is just a notion of a more varied elite as opposed to an educated democracy. And you've used the example twice there, once within Thanet and then within the Stoke context, of being able to talk back to power, which is one of those phrases we use and can get lost in rhetoric. But there's an example of mothers who could talk back and question what's happening at their in their centre, or hear people questioning what's happening in their schools via school governorship. So it's providing an educated democracy. I suppose that's a population that can reflect on what's happened to them and have their say.
Yeah, we need to listen very closely to the stories that some of those women said, for instance, because some of them went on to do advocacy work for others with the local council, the local housing authority, or with a range of other organisations. So the equivalent of, if you like, the tutorial classes, those clusters of the agora, those clusters of people learning the way of working effectively together, of dialoguing to build up a stronger understanding of things and the capacity to express that. It's incredibly important. The point you make about, are we just always expanding the meritocracy? And actually, it's a nightmare word. What people like Williams are focused on is that if we turn our minds away for a moment from the labour market and for educating people for a highly structured set of occupations or set of preoccupations, where it is assumed that people need to have different levels of skill and understanding and knowledge. If we talk about the education of citizens, now there presumably we would want to say something about everyone having the right, the duty, the responsibility maybe to educate themselves, to find the confidence, the means, the agency to be the good citizen. Then shouldn't organizations like universities and a range of other bodies be thinking about what they should do to help the majority of people who, for a variety of reasons, including rather damaging education selection processes, have never found their way to university? Shouldn't we be thinking about creating spaces, bringing university and other resources to bear, where we can pay some attention to building more agoras across civil society? Now, there is an important, if you like, philosophical or theoretical point here, that people, writers like Axel Honneth, who I know you know on recognition, Jürgen Habermas, John Dewey, make a very important point about the health of representative democracy, which I think many of us would argue is in a pretty dire state. And if you spent a bit of time in Stoke, you realise that less than 10% of people in some wards vote in local elections. Dewey, and Honneth makes a lot of use of Dewey, but also Habermas said, was that the strength of representative democracy, in a sense, depends on the strength of democratic processes within civil society.
Yes.
So that people who have the confidence because they are encouraged to be democrats in the workplace, in schools, in the running of public organizations, because they have those sorts of experiences and the kind of self-concept that I'm a citizen and I have something to offer, that in turn will make representative democracy more vibrant.
There again is a contrast to what you talk about as education and fraternity and the neoliberal word, but this sense that the possibility now that education is very individualistic. It's about me getting qualifications that will get me a job, as opposed to maybe seeing education within the greater good.
I think it's troubling. And we need to pause sometimes to ask what are we doing. One of our colleagues, writing in the book we edited together on psychoanalysis and education, who talked about, in the 19th century, and people, and for centuries before that, that people really weren't encouraged to think quite deeply or critically about things because of the power of the church.
Yeah, sure.
In many societies. The great hope of the Enlightenment project was that human reason would be nurtured, that we'd move away from superstition or uninterrogated belief, and that we would build a different quality of society, of knowledgeable citizens. In one article, Catanas, he makes the point that the heteromony of the church, his phraseology, has been replaced by the hegemony of the market and consumption. So a lot of the energy that's going into even higher education, even universities, is about equipping people for their place in the market, maybe as workers, possibly as consumers. Running alongside that, I think we've got something that would have horrified people like Tawney and Williams, who saw a bit of it, Lindsay. If you look at the neoliberal literature, and if you look at some of the writers, which I quote in the book, there is a view that actually most people aren't educable in a kind of university sense. And to make the market work efficiently, what you should really be spending your time on is encouraging them to consume. Encouraging dissatisfaction as consumers, because that's the thing that drives the market. Now, if you contrast that notion of building an educated democracy, building citizens, creating spaces where citizens can engage one with another, with the idea of, if you like, it's hardly an education. It's an indoctrination into being consumers, because it is argued by the free market liberals that that's the thing that drives economies and makes economies successful, then you see there's an enormous contrast here.
There's a huge contrast, and it's different notions of excellence, the drive towards excellence. What could this notion of education as fraternity, education for the greater good, how can that have an impact on Stoke, which we know to be, you say, a very divided city now? I'll pinch a phrase that you use in the book. What are the resources of hope within the narrative that you're telling for an educated democracy in Stoke?
If we've got disturbing evidence of the extent of racism, of xenophobia, if we've got the evidence of the pernicious presence of racist organisations like the English Defence League and so on, if we've also got some evidence, and I stress this is limited in comparison with the scale of xenophobia, then it seems to me there's a lot that we all ought to be worried about. And don't just think Stoke, think Europe more widely, and think, if you like, the Rust Belt of the United States of America. I mean, there are lots of other examples you can offer. Now, my concern then, in a context where, if you like, as in many other places, communities have retreated one from another, is what might we do to build public space? And remember, in an individualized society, public space has declined. The places where we can come together and find time and space to have serious dialogue about crucial issues, those have diminished. It's the individual now who is supposed to be regal, is supposed to know it all, is supposed to be omnicompetent. Now, if you think that some of the problems of racism and so on are worrying, I think what I was doing was to suggest that, okay, we've got the historical examples. Can we imagine together responses that create new kinds of public space where people can learn the ways of democracy? Well, there are probably examples in some of the children's centres have been closed. In some of those centres, of course, if your obsession all the time is just measuring individual progress according to some national standard, then in one sense you're going to miss the point of some of the potentially most important work taking place in these children's centres, like cultivating the learning of democracy. If you then begin to think more broadly, maybe something which is often dismissed as utterly inconsequential, like adult education, begins to take on a new set of possibilities. So the continuing WEA, the Workers' Education Association, they've managed to bring a group of Muslim young women together with a group of white working class women in health groups. There's been investment using lottery money. People involved in an activity can begin to learn not necessarily some grand political discussion, but can begin to learn beyond the stereotypes of each other. People begin to exchange stories. People begin to the tissue of a social relationship is created. Now, as it happens in Stoke, roughly 2008 through till now, austerity took over, and some of these courses, these public spaces, if you like, these microcosms of possibility, were threatened. In a particular case, Victorian public baths was threatened with closure. Now, what some of the educators did, and they got some of the women working on, well, the issue of the closure and what it represented, but the organisation of a campaign. A campaign to oppose the closure of the baths as a precious community resource which brought the different communities together.
An important space.
And they began to use new digital technologies, social media and so on to organise the campaign. Now what I'm suggesting in the book, and what I want people to think about quite seriously by reference to history, but also by reference to the basic question of how is our representative multicultural society to be successful. let's start looking at some of these things in detail to see how some kind of meaningful society, fraternity can be created across difference. And we seem to have here fragile microcosms of what is possible.
Sure. I think that notion of people talking about commonalities becomes the resource that I mentioned earlier, the resource of hope. How do we bring these communities together? I'm aware in the book you tell quite a charming tale of is it the
English Defence League?
English Defence League, and they're protesting outside a mosque
in York.
Yes, and then they come together, and these spaces in which people come together, they still sound very fragile.
They are.
But maybe this is a role for education to validate this as this is a genuine place where humans learn. They might not be getting levels in GCSEs or whatever, but they're learning something.
Well, potentially can.
Potentially, okay, yes.
I mean, that's the issue. Mohammed El-Gamadi was a professor of electronics at York University, and he was also an elder of the mosque.
Yes.
And he said, as the elders were threatened by an EDL march on the Saturday, well, why don't we try something different? There's courage. There's courage.
Incredibly brave.
Let's give it a go. So they made contact with the EDL. 5 leaders came in. I'm not wanting to trivialize it. I'm not wanting to idealize it. It was probably very difficult. You could almost imagine the tension in the room as people took tea together.
Yes,
that was one of the tricks.
Yes.
There was a ritual of tea which actually soothed nerves, got people talking about the tea, no doubt. What kind of tea would you like? Those sorts of small but very important building blocks in human communication. Now, at some stage, as I understand it, someone asked the question, well, so, it's good to have you here, but you're probably feeling it's quite difficult. Someone said, well, what do we want out of life? And there was another conversation that took place about the stereotyping of the other. So some of the EDL people said, well, you're supporters of the Taliban. You're supporters of terrorists.
Sure.
And that led to a response, no, we actually despise the Taliban. Yes. And we are deeply troubled by the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, including, the way in which some of the fundamentalists have exploited mosques. We are deeply bothered by that. And somebody said, well, what do we want what do we want in this life for our families, for our communities? And people said we want some security, we want some employment, we want some confidence that our streets are safe, we want our children to have areas in which they can play and enjoy life, we want good schools. Of course, everybody was saying more or less the same thing. Now, I'm not wanting to say, therefore, multiculturalism was born that day on the streets of York. But I am saying, if we agree with the analysis, as I've put it, of just how serious the issue is, then we should be constantly, all of us, in our everyday lives, in working in universities and schools and so on, looking for the opportunities where we can create good enough fraternal possibility.
If we stop and slow the world down a bit, we can find a way through what might at the moment sometimes seem like irredeemable differences.
Yes, I mean, people like Tawney and Raymond Williams and Lindsay and Temple thought the universities had a pivotal role to play.
Yes.
Universities have retreated from their social responsibility by and large. They feel they've got economic responsibility, so they form alliances with all kinds of industries locally and so on, although the success of that could be debated. What they've lost is the broader vision of a social responsibility to create the good society. Yes. That's what's missing.
Yes, there is the fear that with new measurements within teaching excellence frameworks of employability and contact hours and percentage of marks, that these sort of wider conversations will be lost. But I think what we have here in Distress in the City is a very rich set of narratives that makes us aware that even in very difficult places, there are possibilities of hope. Linden, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Alan.